You tune into VOW FM 88.1 with myself, Jay, and it's that part of the show where we get to speak to a guest poet who's been invited to the show to come and talk about their life experience. And our guest poet for tonight, if you look at our Twitter page, is none other than Sabelo Soko. Sabelo, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for having me today.
Yeah, I'm excited to have the conversation with you today on Poetry Circle because you have literally spent a lot of time within the space of poetry, and I feel as though, from my perspective, just reading some of your bio, you've sort of like earned your stripes as a poet. But I don't want to give away too much of that. For the listeners who are tuning in today, if you wanted to share a little bit about who you are, who would you tell to somebody who's listening tonight who Sabelo Soko is?
Sabelo Soko is a writer slash performer slash curator slash creative entrepreneur. Basically an all-round artist, I guess. Operating as a creative entrepreneur, as I'm saying, to put bread on the table. And everything rotates around spoken word and poetry. So that's the first love.
All right.
And then the curation would be around poetry. The performance would be around word, would be around poetry. And sometimes I consult for advertising agencies and those type of people. But basically that's me. Just a love of the word and stories.
I love that, because I think sometimes people divide poetry in the essence that the art form is literally about storytelling. There's a story that you're sharing through a poetic way, where it involves rhyme and images and metaphors and similes, you know.
And all of those beautiful things.
But then that's getting a little technical around it. But in your work, have you possibly seen that there's particular stigmas that you try and address through your work, or something that's a status quo that you want to change? If you were to take a step back as a poet, as a writer, as a lover of the spoken word, what would you say are, if any, if there are themes or similarities in your work that you try and unearth for us?
I think when I take a bird's eye view of my work, I would then come back with the fact that the work is about the African experience, right?
Okay.
So if there are any stigmas that I try facing or undoing, it would be the experience of a South African male, specifically in South Africa, to say how do we look like, and raising boys, because I'm a father of two boys.
Okay.
You would then find that the work would also touch on that, to say how do we look like as men. And if they are taking the baton from me as their father and they are going through my work, what is it that they are encountering?
Okay.
Especially talking to the times when their father was an active artist, for instance. You know, with the things that are happening in this country and throughout the world.
Yeah.
So you would find that fatherhood becomes the thing that I talk about. I talk about the experiences of black male human beings in this here country specifically. And I think it becomes the outlook to say, how does it really feel to be dispositioned in a place that you call home?
Yo. Those are questions that I think are sometimes difficult to arrive to, especially if, because sometimes we get into a space where you go through life without necessarily taking a moment to reflect or think about what does it mean when I'm living in this way or experiencing the world in this way, you know? So I love the fact that you're being relevant in a sense that you live in South Africa. You are a man in South Africa. You are a black man in South Africa. What does that experience mean from your expression of poetry? You know, and also this idea of you're a father as well added to that. So having to exegete that experience as a parent, for me, I think really makes me, I think it takes a certain level of vulnerability to be able to sort of tap into that and articulate that from a poetic lens. That's just my observation, hearing from what you've said. So
I completely agree with you. Without vulnerability, we do not get to the actual emotion and what it is, because you'd be ducking and diving and using what it is that we use as camouflage to get through certain things. But if you allow yourself to be as bare as possible, you then kind of find that, hey, I am actually looking at the world like this because there are these things that make up who I am. And as soon as you are able to identify those things, you are able to then peel back and start doing the necessary work so that you become a better human being. I love poetry, man.
I love that. And I know this isn't the question that we've sort of addressed, but in your answer you said doing the necessary work. And when I hear you use that phrase, for me, I would automatically associate it to the poetic work that you've put together as your contribution to doing your own personal work. Because it's this idea that the telling of the story is somewhat your own personal story, but also taking a step back at society and seeing what is happening around you as a way to articulate that.
100%.
So would you say us as men, as South Africans, as black, that is part of the work, and in essence making us vulnerable to be able to explain who we are and what we are?
I think the work that needs to be done, regardless of whether you are a poet, artist, writer, or any of these people who find themselves dealing with vulnerability firsthand, work that needs to be done, everybody needs to, at a certain point, there needs to be a pause, stop, re-evaluate before you move forward.
Okay.
And what I have found, poetry, whether you are just consuming it as a reader or you are writing, it requires that to be done, because one line could go so many directions, and if you are willing to just take the pause and ponder what the writer could be saying, you would find Pandora's box that you are opening. And that's the work that I'm talking about. Whether it is me just interacting with people's work, or it is me going through and going back and searching for images that better articulate what it is that I'm feeling right now. Because those images will then sometimes be attached to things that have happened. Whether it is triggers or whether they push me in a certain direction. And somewhere, somehow, it's stuff that eventually needs to be faced in order for us to become the better people that we can become.
I love that.
Yeah.
Because, you know what I find about our human experience? That a lot of the times it's a lot more easier to be a bystander or somebody who's in the bleachers watching the game being played than being a participant in the actual action that is happening. And I'm using metaphors of watching sport or any other thing, whether it is going to the theater, anything when you're sort of like a passive participant, but the minute you're invited to sort of engage yourself, that's when the game changes, where you're having to deal, like you're saying, with themes or stories around your own vulnerability, and for me I find it's often hard, and I'm making an assumption, I don't know if this is factual information, that males specifically sometimes have a hard time dealing with things around vulnerability, and it almost seems as though, because on some level it's not associated with maleness or masculinity or manhood, for that example, it often feels like it doesn't exist in that sphere. Because we don't speak about it often enough, it's not showed often enough, it's not portrayed often enough. But I think having okay, do you want to add to that thought?
I want to add to that thought, because what becomes interesting is as soon as we with ourselves, whether on an intellectual level or just saying I am sitting and thinking back to who I am as a person, you would find that this thing of not being vulnerable is something that gets imposed on us at a certain point. Because when you get told that indoda ayikhali or a man doesn't cry, when you go back as far as my grandfather, for instance, because my grandfather is a person of the 20s, by the time I am running around a strong man, literally. Like he's well into his autumn, approaching his winter.
Yeah.
If you are to look at this lifestyle season.
Yeah.
But you would know that whenever anything happens, the very first person that he goes to is grandmother, right? And whether he cries in front of grandmother there in the bedroom, or he expresses whatever it is but whenever there is something limping, he would always go to grandmother. And grandmother would know him in his barest naked state, you know? And as we then become people of Lokshin, as we are growing up in the townships, then you are told that you need to be hard. Umchita is a hard man.
Okay.
But your grandfather was really not like that, or his father was not like that, because they would know that the pillar of strength is grandmother, Henry.
Yeah.
You know? And so for me, then what becomes interesting is when we are doing the work, are we only willing to look at yesterday, or are we willing to look at the day before yesterday as well?
Sure.
You know?
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure.
That's what I wanted to add on that point.
Sure. I love that. That was such a profound statement you just made. In our state of vulnerability, which way are we willing to look? You know, is it just for right now, yesterday, or the day before yesterday? Because a lot of who we become or who we are is based on where we were. You know? And a lot of the unpacking needs to go back to that space of who was the person who told you first? Indotaikali. You know what I mean? Anyway.
And what was it that they were looking for? What was their intent? Because intent is always an important thing. You know? We have taken certain things on face value and they've become part of who we are, but we do not question why was this thing ever introduced. And as soon as we do that work, you would find that a lot of these issues and problems that we have, they are actually not there. Because the person or the people that we are meant to be, that we have dropped along the way, does not guarantee with this dog-eat-dog situation that we find ourselves in.
And for me, as you're saying that, I would argue that it's the job of the artist then to start creating these awarenesses, to start highlighting some of these issues that we've sort of become numb to, if you know what I say. It's almost as though we've got stuck in a rut in our way of being, whether it is South African, whether it is being black, whether it is being male, whether it's being female, whatever our way of being in the world is. You know, perhaps the job of the artist, or is that too much of a responsibility putting on the artist?
It does feel like too much of a responsibility for the artist, because I could be inclined that way, because I woke up and I noticed that, hey, the reason why my neighbor fought with me last night is not because they really hate me, but there are so many issues associated with just being who they are that then make them triggered a certain way, you know? If I take that direction, it doesn't mean that now Jermaine needs to also go through that to try and figure out how are we as a people, when, you know what I'm saying? And it is very, very important for everybody to be as aware as possible in their work. Be conscious of what it is that you are pushing out, because you can't be pushing out work that looks at women as tokens, for instance. And when we are having conversations like this, you also want to stand on the pedestal and be like, nah, but we are wrong in doing A, B, C, D, and E. And I ask you to share your work then comes back and say, women are a conquest. I will take your woman just to prove that I'm better than you. And so that... as much as I'm saying that it's not everybody's responsibility to do the work that needs to be done, it becomes everybody's responsibility to be responsible with what it is that they decide it's their work that they put out.
Sure. That for me is such a high standard, especially from looking at it from an artist's perspective, you know, because what you're calling for right now in that explanation is literally saying artists should not ask for things that they haven't lived through. You know, if your cause is about equality, if your cause is about transformation, how much of your work is echoing those kind of sentiments? You know, so for me, that's, you know, it raises a higher standard to be like, what am I about? What am I saying? And if what I'm saying is aligned with what I'm doing or living.
Like, are you just selling me a character that I'm supposed to buy, and when you put down the microphone, the character also goes to sleep? Versus there are people who say, like myself, where I would go back to who I am for the sake of doing work with who I am as a person, Whilst doing that work, you would find that you then come back with these trophies, as I call them, these poems that, okay, here's a poem that comes from that work that we were doing, right? This one is good enough to share with the world. No, this one I will keep it for myself.
Okay.
And as I'm saying, it's not for everybody to do that. But for me, I find joy in that, because then also the work becomes authentic.
Yeah.
You find that there is no disconnect in that. Now, this person here is telling me about an experience that really sounds like they heard on the radio. They were listening to VOW, and there was the news, and they put together the clips and whatnot, and they threw out a piece of art. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that. There are people who are able to put themselves in other people's shoes and come back with beautiful work. But I find that because of the type of artist that I am, it is also therapeutic for me when the work is attached to reality and as close as possible to what I know.
Joe, I am having such a good time talking to you that I'm even forgetting about the time. Because we haven't even gotten to some of the other questions that we had prepared, because I think the conversation was just sparked, and it just raised a lot of other things that came up from me. But I want us to go to some music and return. And when we come back, we'll continue our conversation with Sabelo Soko, who's our guest poet tonight, right here on Poetry Circle. And I'm enjoying the conversation. If you want to interact, if you've been listening, if you're hearing what we've been talking about, please interact with us on Twitter. We are at VOW FM. The hashtag to use is Poetry Circle. If you have a question, a comment, a thought, please engage, and we'll unpack more as soon as we return. You're still tuning to VOW FM 88.1 with myself, Jermaine Johnson, aka Che, where we are on Poetry Circle. And I've been having an amazing conversation with our guest poet for this evening. It's none other than Sabelo Soko. Sabelo, welcome back.
Thank you, Jermaine.
Great stuff. I want us to continue with the conversation that we had, because there were so many, I think, profound things that you were sharing when we first spoke. But I wanna latch and spend our energy focusing on storytelling. Because from my opinion, being able to be a poet and articulate yourself in a poetic way allows you to be able to access the art form of storytelling as well. Having said that, would you say that storytelling has a way of us better understanding ourselves?
I totally believe that. As I was saying earlier on, that for instance, an art form like poetry, whether you are creating poems or you are consuming poems, it requires you to have that slow down moment. You can't just drink from a fire hose and say, I will quench my thirst.
Okay.
But rather, it requires you to have that slow dip in thing in order for you to fully understand what it is. And I think the interesting thing, especially with poems, in the storytelling conversation, is how a sentence or one line or a stanza could denote different meanings from person to person, especially if the work is being done, as I'm saying, that slow down type of moment, almost like meditating, like looking at it. How does it really deal with me, this text that I am looking at? And like that, then you would find that dealing with the same text, you could come back with different emotions and images from what Sabelo could come back with. And that brings us closer to understanding who is Jermaine, who is Sabelo. And if I am doing that work on my own, it helps me to get closer to understanding who I am, which is basically what you are asking. So I definitely believe that, and I believe every household should be consuming poems, literature, stories in one way or the other, because how we interact with stories kind of shows who are you. Are you a sympathetic person? Are you a person who doesn't care? Because now there is this entire journey that has been taken on the story, and when it gets, you know what I'm saying? So
I love your response, but I want to interject with a comment on our Twitter page. The person is Ink on Everything. And he's
Ink
just
on Everything.
Yeah, I think Ink on Everything is just commenting on what we just talked about. He says there's a profound engagement, especially on the point of the artist's responsibility. We can only pull and produce from what is truth to us. As soon as we try to present a message detached from our truth, we dilute the impact of the work. You know, so that's his contribution toward the conversation tonight around being authentic in the creation, performing and sharing of that truth. You know?
Yeah, I love it.
But I would counter argue on that. You know why I would say that?
Why would you counter argue?
Because truth is always relative. And this is why I would say that. Sabelo, you and I are having an interview on radio right now, right?
Yes.
And at this very present moment, what you're experiencing as truth for you could be very different from what's truth for me right now. And in that instance, I would go, based on the conversation that we're having at this point, truth could be relevant. I mean...
But what becomes interesting though, you see, as you are saying what you are saying, I interjected and I said,
okay,
right?
Yeah.
And in order for us to know whether what you are saying resonates with me or not, you have to say it. You know what I'm saying? And if we just gonna
snapping
say,
up in the studio.
Either way, if you are able to come close to what you call your truth, you know, it will resonate like it is your truth. And if I am meant to affirm that, just like it has happened now as I'm making an example, I will affirm it. If it does not move me that direction, I am not I'm not forced to affirm that. I can just keep quiet and be like, yeah, I hear you.
Come on. I love that.
Yeah.
So, who are some of your favorites based on your experience and work that you've listened to? If there's an artist or somebody that has been, you know, an inspiration or somebody you look toward, are there a few people that you would love to see live? And if so, why?
You know, because of, I think, the time that I started doing this thing, I've been fortunate enough to see most of the people that I regard as my greats. I have seen Don Matera a number of times.
Oh, Don.
A number of times. So when I saw the question, and I was asking myself, because there is a father, Sipos Palmer, he's no more though. I think I would have loved to see him do his work on stage, because whenever I read his poems, so there is something that I've been interested in, to say, how do we sound like when we speak this language that you and I are conversing in, you know?
Wow.
So being a South African from South Africa, with the borders that are there and whatever it is that contributes to my tongue, how does English of here sound, you know? That after robot English, you know? Anywhere else that after robot thing, it exists here. So Ntate's Pamela kind of understood very early, and his work would be as playful as that he would just play around with these images and the way we put together words as South Africans, whether it is interacting with English or interacting with Xhosa, whichever were the two languages that he operated within. And so whenever I read the work, it performs itself. And I would ask myself, what then happens when he is in front of you?
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
So it's the same as the Soko Rampuluke, for instance. Papa Rem does exactly that. You read the work, it jumps at you. When you see him on stage, it is multiplied. I think, yeah. Sipos Panda becomes that person that I would have loved to experience him on stage.
I love that. Now, with the rise of COVID, we have been limited in our interaction in terms of, you know, collective gatherings. There's limitation of a number of people that you can have in one space, and people had to sort of keep their art alive by going online. you know, whether it was through an Instagram live, a Facebook live. We had to find other ways of still expressing. For you personally, as a poet, as a performer, what role has social media or the use of social media platforms do you think it has had a role to play in your either expressing or performing of your work?
It definitely has, because I think when we went to lockdown, that first one, the
hard lockdown.
Yeah, the idea was that the project that I'm working on now, that I'm preparing to release, should have actually been a project that was going to come out 2020. Of COVID, I then had to push that back, which then meant I had to refocus on the old work that I had.
Okay.
So, for instance, I was able to be part of a program at ICA. That's the University of Cape Town, the Creative Arts Program. Infecting the City. It was last year. So I was able to do that being in Joburg, so virtually it was able to happen. And I think I'm also thinking of social media, because one would think Facebook, Instagram, and those spaces. Those spaces have been okay, engagement is fine. But during lockdown, I found, for instance, there's a site, it's EthnoCloud, just like SoundCloud, right? But it focuses on ethnic sounds. So I've been uploading my work there. There is a nice community of over 300 countries. In the past month, one of my tracks that I have there, poem, was number 3 in all of those countries. You know, it's one of the highest, most played tracks. So I think looking at it from the social media space, you then notice that it is no longer just people in Mpumalanga, Gauteng, and South Africa who are tuning in, and Swaziland. But rather they are people in Netherlands who are saying, "Oh my God, I loved whatever you were saying there, even though it was in Zoom." You know, to a point that the numbers are pushing you to number 3 in their top 10. You know. So it's an interesting time, for as long as you are willing to play with these different platforms that are there. And there is a lot of them. It's not just these Facebook and the ones that we are familiar with.
Sure. So it has definitely exposed us to different kinds of platforms, people, and even continents, in a way that...
And even the way of telling the stories and throwing the stories out to the world. It has been altered so dramatically in a very positive way. A poem can exist on the page, it can exist as a video. You know what I'm saying? They are different formats that people are playing around with because of the time that we find ourselves in. And it is very interesting. It's a beautiful time.
I love that. So I want to move on to your work that you've about to release in a few weeks. For us who do not know what it's about, do you want to share a little bit about that? What can we expect? Where it's going to be released? What it's about? As much information as you'd like to share.
Right. So I am 2 projects deep. I did my first project was released in 2013. It was titled 2380. It did very well because we were nominated for a South African Traditional Music Award. Unfortunately, we did not get it. But
no, the nomination is good enough.
Yeah,
because
the nomination, the note was a thing.
Yeah, because it means like we see you.
Yes. And especially because that time, poetry wasn't a thing that somebody would say, "Yo, I am doing this full time without anything else."
Yeah.
You know? And the idea then was to say, how does it look like if we say, this is all we are doing? And that was followed by another project where I did language work, where I basically went back to try and figure out how does this indigenous language that I call my mother tongue sound, because I was taught in English and Afrikaans when I did school.
Yes.
You know, so my second project then became Umkhondo, which was a project that is predominantly in Zulu, or it is in Zulu, exploring basically my mother tongue. The follow-up, which is what you are asking me about now, is the project titled Spin Venek. Spin Venek then almost becomes a combination of these 2 projects. My first project, which was done in English, and my second project, which was done in isiZulu.
Yeah.
It then combines the 2 pieces and tries and figure out what I was saying about Sipos Pamla, for instance, how do we sound like when we are saying we are not chasing Sharazu's language, but we are being authentic to the time that we find ourselves in? You know, and so if I am really looking at that, so you find that the poem is written in the language that I speak in when I am there, normal myself, you know, which could jump from English, isiZulu to the street lingo. Poems and things that I'm talking about, it's exactly what I explained earlier on, which is fatherhood. How do we look like? How do we become better people? The scourge of drugs that we are facing right now. I'm raising boys, as I said. It's easy to say it doesn't touch me, but however many years down the line, you could be the same person crying. Then for me, you on that. So if we are really spinning this Venek and we are focusing on who we are, what are the problems that we are facing and how do we become better? Then becomes my memory, so to say. How does it look like, as I was saying, the day before yesterday? That's basically the work. That's the new project. I think the other thing you asked was, where is it going to be released? I'm definitely putting it out on all streaming platforms. It will be available. We are launching at the Joburg Theatre on the 5th of March.
Okay.
It will be a day show from 2 o'clock till 5. So 3 hours, very, very intense.
All right.
Poetry after poetry, chants, hymns, and basically who I think I am when I'm vibrating outside of what is the world expecting of me.
Wow. So that's something people, if you are listening, this is what's happening on the 5th of March. Our guest who is on the show tonight is definitely introducing some of his new work. And if it's something you've been interested to experience or what you've been listening for our conversation, please show up. It's going to be at the Joburg Theatre, right?
Yes, Joburg Theatre, 5 March from 2 o'clock till 5. Tickets are available at the theatre. They're available on the website. They're also available at the door box office. You can definitely get them.
All right, this is on a Saturday, right?
This is on a Saturday during the day. So you can come through, enjoy the day, even with children, and you can still get home before it becomes dark.
Great stuff. So this is an event by Sabelo Soko, who's releasing some of his new work. It's in a few weeks on the 5th of March. Some of his new work, if you've been intrigued or inspired or interested or curious about some of the content of the conversation that we've been having tonight, please come and show up and support the art, support the poem, the poets, support the work. I'm definitely considering going as a way of showing my support.
Come, Jermaine, come.
As a host of this show, because we're all about poetry and pushing forward this art form. You know, so Sabelo, we are going to show up. If you're listening tonight, please come through. 5th of March, Joburg Theatre. But I'm noticing the time when we're running almost out of time, because I know Sabelo has another appointment around 7. So I'm just debating with myself if you should go ahead and ask you to share some of your poetry. You know what? Let's do one song, and when we come back, Sabelo, will you be able to bless us with one poem?
Yeah, I can do a poem.
All right. Again, you are tuning to VOW FM 88.1 with myself, Jay, host of Poetry Circle. We have an amazing guest tonight, Sabelo Soko, who's been in the industry for such a long time. He has a new project coming out on the 5th of March at Joburg Theatre, starting at 2 p.m. Please head over and support us in a few weeks. And if you want to have your life changed, if you want to experience art form through the spoken word, please go. When we come back, Sabelo is actually going to bless us with one of his work. Stay tuned. So tune into VOW FM 88.1 with myself, Jay, and we're about to get into the wrap-up of our interview with our guest poet tonight on Poetic Page, which is Sabelo Soko, and he's going to be sharing one of his works with us. So Sabelo, how would like you to go about this? Maybe if you want to, if you're able to, give us a brief background about what was happening at the time when you started creating this poetic work, and then just go ahead and share.
Right. This is a piece that is basically a conversation with these Jazami.
Okay.
My dogs.
All right.
Yes. You with heavy lungs, with your shell-shaped tongues, petty pickers of grills and crumbs, Your hands are leg bound, a tail of a tame hound. You were born wagging maiden frills, hankering for the care of fathers who cover the lights of other shelters with their halos of flies. In the wake of neon headlines and artificial intelligent lies, you are leashed to the dark. There shadows you bark and tip over dustbins with entitled expectations. Who taught you predictability as a trick? Tying a servitude collar to see your distance beyond the scratch of your docking face. Trapped in your deworming days, a nightmare from which you whimper awake. Do you recall the tales of your dreams? Do you ever wonder after their sins? After the quest that calls you home, for being domesticatable by a pole, why then the kernel despair? Could there be more to your breath than just upheaval-loaded threats and silent moments of dead air? Could there be? Thank you, Jermaine.
I'm just snapping it up here in the studio, and I would have loved to have time to unpack some of the statements that resonated with me, but I know we're running out of time because I know you also have another engagement. But before I let you go, Sabelo, where can people reach you on social media platforms, just as a way of, if they've heard what you're about tonight, they can continue to interact with some of your work?
At Sabelo Soko on all platforms. So Facebook, Sabelo Soko, at Sabelo Soko on Instagram, at Sabelo Soko on Twitter. Also on SoundCloud, you can find the work there. If you wanna buy the work is available on Bandcamp. You can definitely get it there. And these other platforms that are popular there, iTunes and these other places, you can find the work there. But for communication purposes, I'm available on all social platforms as Sabelo Soko.
Okay. Sabelo, thank you so much for coming onto the show tonight, and just sharing your experience, your work, your passion, your art with us. We really appreciate it. And for myself, here at VOW FM with the team, we want to wish you all the best going forward, whatever the next thing is, and hopefully we get to see you on the 5th of March with your new project.
I believe I am going to see you on the 5th of March.
Yeah.
I believe that.
I'm planning to be there. And final words before I let you go.
Final word from me before you let me go is that I am really looking forward that's able to come out on the 5th.
Okay.
And if there is anything that people can take away from this conversation is the fact that we are who we are, and up until we go back and figure out why are we the way we are, we remain exactly the way we are. So something needs to change. Something needs to move.
Sure. Those are some profound words of wisdom from our guest tonight on Poetry Circle, Sabelo Soko. Find out why we are the way we are.